This is Lab Medicine Rounds, a curated podcast for physicians, laboratory professionals, and students. I'm your host, Justin Kreuter, the bow tie bandit of blood, a transfusion medicine pathologist at Mayo Clinic. Today, we're doing something a little different. Rather than our regular interview format, we want to take a very deliberate hitting pause. This episode is really a call to action for your feedback. And so thank you, listeners, for joining us today for this very important conversation about how can this podcast get better going forward in the future. So we might start out by saying, why is this podcast even important? Since the very beginning, we've started out with this idea that we wanted to have a podcast that helped to bridge this gap between the clinical practice and laboratory medicine. Our ideal that we wanted to have, we wanted to create content that kind of showcased clinical aspects of laboratory medicine, but also laboratory aspects of clinical medicine. We want it to be a podcast that we share with those colleagues of ours on our healthcare teams. And also something for students that are coming up and learning about how does this practice of medicine work. This is really a fundamental interprofessional collaboration, the way that the laboratory practice supports and works with the clinical practice. And so this is why we think that our podcast is important. And I wanted to start out this conversation by putting this, because that's the frame of mind we want. We want this podcast to be something that we're all sharing with colleagues that work in medicine in a slightly different way. And if this is that podcast that you're doing that, as a laboratory professional, you're sending it to clinical colleagues so they get a better understanding of what you do, or sometimes it's a clinician who's emailing their laboratory colleagues to say, is this how this works in our lab? If this is what we're doing, this is great. We're on the right track. If it's not, we'd really love to hear your feedback about how we can move closer to that kind of reality of having a podcast that is helping you locally spark conversation, developing these relationships, and really having these insightful conversations that we're really always talking about. Things are going to bring you a professional joy in your practice. So, what have we been doing with this platform so far? So, I mean, some of you have maybe been listening since the very beginning. Our first 3 episodes went live at the beginning of September in 2019. So we've been creating consistent content since then. And if you're looking on our feed, you see now we have over 50 episodes that we've created, hopefully helping the laboratory practice and the clinical practice connect. And over that time, we have tried to innovate and do new things. For example, if you're watching this on YouTube, we've moved to recording the video of these interviews and posting this on YouTube, because this is a great way to connect and connect with a larger audience and hopefully spark more of these meaningful conversations. In this last year alone, in 2021, we created over 19 hours of content. So we've got a good intent that we want to be a podcast that is creating value for you, that you find valuable for sparking ideas and conversations and building relationships in your local practice. Our team works hard at it. It's quite an investment, and it's not just me. I think I need to give a shout out to Heidi Zunker and Melissa Peterson are fundamental this whole time throughout this podcast. They've been at it since the very beginning. They're the ones who are working behind the scenes to make sure that we have a schedule, that we are able to maintain that schedule, collaborations with all the different moving parts here to get a Mayo Clinic branded podcast put together and published. We also have our audio engineer, our audiophile extraordinaire, Rick Anderson, who is also been supporting this podcast since the very beginning. He's the one that makes sure that we sound good and look good on this. And so this has really been a wonderful team. And this whole team since the very beginning has been very dedicated that this be a podcast that's meaningful, practical, and that is providing value. And so that's where we get really to this ask today. Why are we taking this deliberate pause? Is we want to ask you, the listeners, to share with us your feedback. This really is meaningful to us. We have been kind of trying to, work through the feedback we've been able to solicit from folks and, our own ideas on how we can kind of move forward. But we really wanted to take a deliberate pause at this point in the podcast and reach out to listeners and say, here's a link below. So we want to make it easy. So look in the show notes below this content. And there's a link to a survey. It's anonymous, and also all the questions are not required. So if you find yourself right now, you're listening to this, as you're driving someplace, once you get to your destination, and maybe you have 30 seconds before your first meeting, please click into that link. And if you only have 30 seconds, you can share your general gestalt with us about, are we doing a good job? Do you know a specific thing that we could kind of do better, that we should be working on or thinking about working on with future episodes? If you have more time, please feel free to share more on what you think we could do to make this podcast more valuable to you. And then also, like you said in the beginning, our main mission this whole time has been working to connect the clinical practice and laboratory medicine through insightful conversations. And so that's the framework we really want for this feedback, is how can we accomplish this mission better? And for you personally, how can this podcast bring you greater value in the future? So that's where are we going? It's an exciting time in this podcast, because I think we're at a point where we're really looking out to you, the listeners, on what are ways we could innovate? What are the ways we could iteratively improve this podcast to be better? And where are we going? I'm really excited to see where this goes. So we wanted to take a deliberate pause. I didn't want this to just be a quick ad that you see, or a 30-second ask for feedback. I wanted to take an episode to really tell you how important this is. And I really hope that each one of you clicks into the link to give us whatever amount, small or large, of feedback that you're able to provide. But this would be profoundly helpful to us. So we've been rounding with you on this Lab Medicine podcast about how we can iteratively improve lab medicine rounds. So to all of our listeners, a very sincere thank you. Thanks in advance for clicking on the link below and sharing your valuable thoughts. Please, as always, subscribe and follow us. And until our next rounds together, we encourage you to continue to connect lab medicine and the clinical practice through insightful conversations.